Hello, my name is Steve Harden. I'm the CEO and founder of LifeWings, and this is another edition of the LifeWings Leadership Lab. Today we're going to talk about training, how to become a more effective leader by understanding the correct and the effective training process, and more importantly, understanding that telling is not training. So I started this edition of the Leadership Lab off by saying telling is not training. Well, why did I do that? Well, that's quite honestly the most common mistake I see on the part of healthcare leaders as we work with implementing patient safety or quality improvement programs, right? So any sort of initiative that you're implementing is going to require people to have a change in behavior. They either have to learn a new task or a new way of doing an old task, or new policies and new procedures come into place. And if you don't understand what effective training is, you're not going to be successful in moving the organization from point A to point B. So the most common mistake I see here is leaders are busy, they're in a hurry, they have a lot to do, their to-do lists are full, and so they develop a new policy or develop a new procedure, and the way they want to get people to comply with the new policy or the procedure is just tell them, right? So if they're having difficulty, I always go back and say, okay, well, let's look at your training process. And typically what you'll find is they needed a change in behavior, so the institution wrote up a new policy, they disseminated that in writing, they talked about it in meetings, but the entire training process was all didactic. It was all one way. It was basically, hey, here's the new policy, here's the new procedure, it goes into effect on the first of the month. They might have written an instruction paper on how to comply with the policy or the procedure, and then, you know, the hammer drops and they expect compliance. And typically you're not going to get the level of compliance you need in order to be successful in moving your organization from point A to point B. So don't make that mistake. Telling is not training. So what is training? Well, you really haven't trained until you've done 4 things, right? And what are those 4 things? The first of it is you have to explain to the learner the how and the why. This is how you do this new skill or do this new task or do this new procedure, and this is why you need to do it this way, all right? So what's the imperative for doing it this way? You have to explain the why. And until you've explained both the how to do it and the why to do it this way, you haven't really covered that step. Step number 2 in effective training is to model the behavior, model the skill, model the procedure. Either show someone yourself how to do it correctly, or show them a video of someone else doing it correctly. But the way the adult learner learns most effectively is to develop a mental model in their own mind of how this procedure or task looks when it's done correctly, right? And so then they try to model their behavior or try to make their behavior match the model. So modeling is really important. It's important for folks to see how the new task or the new procedure is done correctly. The third thing we're going to do is give them an opportunity to practice, but practice must be done in a realistic scenario. So it's either got to be on the job, or the simulation has got to be realistic and have high fidelity to the real world. And that practice also needs to be under the watchful eye of an expert coach, right? So a coach who knows how to do the procedure or the process and who has expertise in it has to watch the learner as they do their first practice sessions. And the reason you want a coach is because, one, you need to intervene if they get off the wrong track, right? So you don't want to develop the neural pathways doing the procedure the wrong way. It's perfect practice that makes perfect. So the coach needs to intervene if the learner gets off track. But more importantly, the coach is there to make sure that the learner's practice attempt is matching the model. And the reason they want to do that is because it's going to take us to step number 4, and that is the coach has to offer feedback to the learner. And the feedback is, how well did your practice session match the model? And if it didn't, here's what you need to do to close that gap, right? So that feedback is most effective if you let the learner provide self-assessment, and where they can't provide self-assessment because they don't know, don't have enough knowledge, then the coach steps in and provides the self-assessment, right? And like we learned in the last leadership lesson, you need to make sounds come out of their mouth. So ask them for readback, ask them for feedback, and ask questions to make sounds come out of their mouth to make sure they have the right knowledge about the mental model in their head, right? So unless you've explained the how and the why, unless you've modeled the new skill or procedure or task, unless you've given the learner an opportunity to practice under the watchful eye of a coach, and unless you've offered them feedback, constructive feedback on how their practice can more effectively match the model, then you really haven't trained, right? So it's just critically important for you as a leader to understand what effective training is, what that looks like, because if you're not doing effective training, it's really hard to develop the skill sets to move the organization from point A to point B. So your action step for this particular leadership lab is to go back and think about where you're having difficulty getting the proper procedure or task accomplished, or you're having difficulty getting compliance with a new procedure or a new task, and then ask yourself, have I done all 4 steps? Has the organization done all 4 steps of the training process? And if not, which one did we miss? And then you're going to have to develop a training plan that'll take you back and cover one of those 4 steps, right? So wherever you're having difficulty getting the behavior or the procedures done the way you want them, go back and analyze your training process against these 4 steps. And if you'll use these 4 steps as you develop training and education in the future, this will always be a really good checklist to make sure that you're doing your training or your educational activities correctly. Right? If you want to go deeper, I highly recommend a book called Coaching for Improved Work Performance if you're a leader. That really ought to be in your leadership library. And until next time, I wish you every success on your leadership journey.